Up next is a fireside chat on breaking boundaries, looking at the limits of planet Earth. Owen Gaffney, who, in addition to his position at Stockholm Resilience Center, is also an analyst and policy advisor at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And, fun fact, he's also one of the advisors who guided David Attenborough's documentary, Our Planet. He's online with Nicolas Gourdel, the deep tech lead at Hello Tomorrow. Over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Kayla. So welcome everyone. Also from my side, I'm Nico, and it's a great pleasure to have Owen Gaffney here with me on the screen. So Owen is a worldwide recognized Earth systems analyst, an inspiring futurist and writer. Owen, how are you doing this morning?
Here we go, the famous mute challenge. Yeah, thank you, Nico, for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
So from where are you calling in today?
I'm calling in from Stockholm. Actually, we live on the Stockholm archipelago, and it's a freezing cold day today. We had our first snow last night.
All right. So by now you are in Stockholm or around Stockholm. I've seen when preparing that session that you started your career as an aeronautical engineer. So how come that you ended up in Earth system science now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm from Ireland originally, and I had this kind of I was really obsessed with space growing up. So I studied astronautic engineering in the UK. But when I finished the job, when I finished studying there, I felt that I was still obsessed by space, but a lot of the industries then involved in that were working with the defense industry, and I wasn't so interested in working for defense companies or on the defense side of things. So that's where a huge amount of the investment is in space. So I decided to take more of a scenic route with my career, and I studied film and journalism and writing, and became more and more involved. I'd always been involved in environmental issues and environmental activism when I was younger, but I slowly moved into more writing about the state of the planet. And then a few years ago, I got an email from the Royal Academy of Sciences in Stockholm, and you don't ignore emails from them. And they invited me to see if I'd be interested in a position at the International Biosphere Program, which is a big international research program looking at the state of the planet, trying to put together a picture of the whole state of the planet, the ocean, the land, the ice sheets, the forests, and humans, the human impact on the planet. So this whole thing, and this really intrigued me. So I joined International Biosphere Program, and from there moved to Future Earth and Stockholm Resilience Center, and now Potsdam Institute.
That's great. That's a great journey. Can you, for the audience that is not 100% familiar with the term Earth system science, explain in a sentence or two what you do on a daily basis, or what an Earth system scientist actually does?
Yeah. So really, Earth system science started emerging in maybe the late 70s, early 80s, when it was realized that we can't just look at systems, the major systems on Earth on their own. The water cycle, the climate cycle, the nitrogen cycle, or the ice sheets or the oceans. So these things are all deeply interconnected, and if you push one, you're going to affect the other. And humans are now playing an increasingly dominant role in that system as well. So you need to look at the human system too. So it's really, it's a bunch of researchers who are really interested in those interconnections and trying to put together that that hole where you get sort of emergent properties from these interactions.
So you mentioned before that you work for, among many other things, for those two very world-renowned institutes, so the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the Stockholm Resilience Center. So what does make those places special? So what is the common foundational concept that those two institutes actually push forward and that all is underlying all their research now?
Yeah, so I guess one of the key idea that's emerged from Earth system science over the last few decades is the idea of the Anthropocene, and the Anthropocene is the geological epoch we are currently in, and this was first proposed back in the year 2000 at a meeting of the International Biosphere Program by Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen. He won this Nobel Prize for his work on the ozone layer and how human chemicals could eat the ozone layer and create a hole. So at a meeting he proposed, we were talking about the Holocene. We've been in the Holocene since the end of the last ice age. So for about 10,000 years, Earth has been in this geological period called the Holocene. And this has been a remarkably stable period in Earth's history. Temperature has only risen one degree or fallen 1 degree in that entire period, a kind of very, very narrow band. But now we can see huge amounts of change going on Earth caused by humans. And so Paul Crutzen proposed that we've left the Holocene behind. We've entered a new geological epoch, which he coined the Anthropocene. And this has been a guiding principle, a guiding idea within Earth system science and driving Potsdam Institute and Stockholm Resilience Center now. And I think it's a profound concept. To me, it's equivalent to Darwin's theory of evolution or Copernicus's heliocentricity, that Earth goes around the sun, in that it forces us to rethink our place on Earth. We are the prime driver of change currently on Earth. This is a new responsibility for us as a planet. This is a new realization for us as a species.
And can we put a date on this change of epoch? So like I read that some people say that could be back in the 16th century or end of 15th when Columbus discovered Americas. I know that other colleagues of yours put it at the around the Industrial Revolution, others maybe in the 1950s, 60s when growth and consumption hit overdrive. So can we put a date on this?
Yeah, so we published a paper in 2015 suggesting that it's really the 1950s is when we reached that inflection point on the exponential curve. Before that, we were having an increasingly big impact on the planet, but we weren't going beyond the natural boundaries of the planet. But since the 1950s, we'd been really, really pushing things way beyond in all areas, not just climate, but in terms of biodiversity loss, in terms of land use change, in terms of ocean acidification, changing of the nitrogen cycle, changing of the hydrological cycle, the water cycle on Earth. So really, pushing those boundaries by about 1950s, and now we are way beyond in all areas. So this is, and in fact, we've even got a marker. 16th of July, 1945, the first atomic bomb test in the air, and that's left a radioactive signature. Radioactive particles have went all the way around Earth at that time, and so future geologists will be able to see that layer in the rock. And to be able to date it pretty precisely as the start of some rupture in the Earth system, some major shift.
You named some of the issues that we are currently facing, like ocean acidification or generally also the decreasing biodiversity on our planet. How bad is it actually today? So when I tune into conversations around the state of our biosphere, I often hear about those tipping points that we should stay far away from. Can you give us a little bit of an update on where we are and what those tipping points are?
So back in 2008, a group of researchers met in Germany, in fact, to do an analysis of tipping points, the first big synthesis of the tipping points in the climate system. And they identified about 15 tipping points. And these relate to Arctic sea ice, melting of the Greenland ice sheet, changes to the ocean circulation in the Atlantic, the changes to monsoons, changes to boreal forests, the Amazon rainforest, permafrost, the Antarctic ice sheet, and instabilities there, and identified these as areas that could undergo very, very rapid change if if we keep putting incremental pressure on them. Eventually, they'll reach a failure point, like the straw that broke the camel's back, and they'll start changing irrecoverably. Even if we stop emissions or reduce emissions, they'll still keep on changing. So that's the risk with tipping points. And back in 2008, the issue was way off in the distance. I mean, the estimates were we might not hit tipping points until 2050, 2100, when temperatures rise 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. And so that's where we were until last year. Myself and colleagues, we revisited the tipping points from 2008 and had a look at what is happening currently in these areas. And what we found has been really the surprise of my career. I was absolutely stunned that, in fact, of the 15 tipping points, 9 are already undergoing massive, large-scale change. And when it comes to the Antarctic ice sheet, parts of it may have already crossed tipping points. We're seeing trillions of tons being lost in Greenland and Antarctica, trillions of tons, and this is really surprising. And now we're looking at, is there any way these could actually be restabilized, or will they continue to lose trillions, and will this accelerate? And that's the big risk. And there's some major research looking at that at the moment, but it's very worrying. But then when you look elsewhere, we've lost half of the coral reefs on Earth, and we're predicted to lose, virtually all of them in the next few decades. And the Amazon rainforest, one of the most important stores of carbon on Earth, within 15 years, it could start moving from being a store of carbon to start emitting carbon. So because of the downward trend, it's on. We're seeing unprecedented fires and droughts there over the last 20 years. This is a combination of climate change and deforestation. So we're seeing very, very big changes in the Earth system, which makes us very, very concerned.
Yeah, I guess that was a very dark surprise that you came across there in your research a few years back. So I think in response, some of your colleagues, and I believe even including you came up with the planetary boundaries. Can you describe that concept within 1 or 2 sentences before we then head on in discussing a bit more what we can actually do to stabilize the Earth?
Right, yeah, and it wasn't me that came up with this. This was Johan Rockström, Will Steffen, and colleagues, Tim Lenton and team, and some of these researchers had been working on the tipping points earlier. And this basically the planetary boundaries idea is, if we've had this very stable state for 10,000 years, what keeps us in that stable state? What keeps that Holocene stability? There was a workshop in Stockholm or in Sweden back in 2007 to look at that. And the research team came out of that workshop with, they hadn't identified one boundary that keeps us in that stable state, or 1,000. They identified 9 key boundaries. And at that time, they said that we'd crossed 3 of those boundaries relating to climate, biodiversity loss, and our use of fertilizers, nitrogen and phosphorus. And then since then, they've concluded that we've actually transgressed a further boundary on land use change. We're using about half of Earth's land, and we cannot go beyond that. We must stop land use expansion, or we risk that Holocene stability. So this is a priority list for the planet. It's 9 boundaries, and we really have to look at 4 of them that we've transgressed, which is why it's been so influential among policymakers and the business community.
And what is your recipe like? What's your approach? So I've seen that you recently published the Exponential Roadmap to Sustainability. Is that the answer to keeping us within the boundaries of our planet?
So we start reaching a cluster of tipping points if we go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're already at 1.1 degrees Celsius, 1.1, 1.2, and we're rising at 0.2 degrees Celsius a decade. We're running out of time. We have a very limited carbon budget. In fact, if we keep emitting at current rates, we will use our remaining carbon budget for our remaining time on Earth within 7 years. That's with a 2 in 3 chance of staying below or around 1.5 degrees. We extinguish our budget in 7 years. It's unlikely we'll stay below 1.5, but if we can keep around 1.5, that is absolutely a critical priority for us as a species right now. And to do that, we need to halve emissions every decade, at the very least, to reach net zero by 2050 at the very latest. We published the first paper on that trajectory in 2017, because we realized that the messages to policymakers from the academic community was, well, we need to reach net zero sometime in the second half of the 21st century, so 30, 40 years from now. But that essentially sent a message that we can have a slow decrease in emissions, or wait for some unicorn technology to turn up to take our carbon emissions out of the atmosphere. But we realized that, in fact, to reach net zero by 2050, we have to do most of the work now. Our emissions are so high, we can no longer rely on an incremental trajectory and a hope that technology will save us. We, in fact, need to halve emissions between now and 2030, and again by 2040, and again by 2050. And this is a useful framing because it applies to me as an individual, to you as an individual, but also to cities, to businesses, to companies, to and up to the global scale, so it's this kind of cross-scalar thinking around the challenge. But we need to do more than that, though. We'll also need to draw carbon out of the atmosphere and turn our agricultural systems into stores of carbon. We need regenerative agriculture. So it's those 3 things combined that is what we call the carbon law for stabilizing the climate.
And do you see some of this reflected, so particularly the carbon law, in the big policies and plans of the governments? I think just yesterday, Canada specified a bit their plan on how to get to net zero emissions in 2050. And I know other regions came up as well and came forward. How satisfied are you with this? And do you see the carbon law kind of being implemented in those things?
Yeah, so I mean, we're seeing something I could not have imagined a year or so ago. We've got 120 countries now saying that they'll be net zero by 2050, and this is absolutely remarkable. This is a social tipping point, a political tipping point. June 2019, Britain was the first G7 country to say it was going to be net zero by 2050. In a very, very fractured political environment, that Britain couldn't agree on anything at that point, and suddenly they make this phenomenal agreement that is going to change the economy for generations to come. And then now Europe has said the same. Now, incredibly, back in September, Xi Jinping, the president of China, said he would be net zero by at the latest 2060. We couldn't believe that. And then you see Japan and South Korea also falling in line around that. And now with the Biden administration in the United States, we're in a position where the economic powerhouse of the world is China, US, and Europe. Without doubt, that drives the global economy. Those three areas are now committing to net zero by 2050. This is an absolute transformative moment. Of course, they actually must go much faster. They have a responsibility as the biggest emitters to go much faster, and they need to set targets to halve by 2030. But this is definite progress. We're seeing Britain announcing this week that it's going to phase out internal combustion engines by 2030. A year ago it was 2045, I think. 2040. In February it's 2035. Now it's 2030 because the economics is there. It's going to be it's economically viable to do it very, very rapidly. Now it's we're on an unstoppable trajectory.
So I get that so basically the carbon law is more for you than just a pure description of what needs or what should go on in terms of reducing our emissions, but should really be the North Star that people, companies, and states try to reach, right? So you've chosen this exponential framing for a certain reason. Can you elaborate a bit more there, where it comes from, the idea of calling that a carbon law and this exponential framing?
Yeah, so the Paris Agreement in 2015, set in place we need to stay well below 2 degrees and aim for 1.5. And myself and colleagues were thinking about, how do we frame that? What is the trajectory to go on? And at the same time, we're having sort of parallel conversations with a friend and colleague, former executive at Intel, who's very, very here in Stockholm, Johan Falk, who's very committed to action on climate. And he was saying, you should consider framing this in terms of exponentials. The exponential framing in the tech sector, as Moore's law, has had a phenomenal influence. There's a very simple rule of thumb, a simple heuristic of doubling computer power every 2 years. And every company, just is on that track. They follow it. They have that expectation. And there's something about these very simple rules and ideas or heuristics within economic systems that are very, very powerful drivers of change. And he said, he was encouraging us to think in terms of that way. And of course, our original thinking was, well, exponentials go up. That and this is the last thing we want to do is increase emissions. But then we started thinking in terms of framing these trajectories as exponential decreases instead. And I think it is powerful. It front loads the problem as well. The biggest change needs to happen soonest, that first halving. So we think it's been useful, and it shows the sort of the needs, the importance of connecting and networks and having varied networks for ideas in ecosystems. Where do ideas come from in science and technology?
I fully agree. And beyond halving emissions each decade, what can particular companies do else in your view to contribute to this transformation to a sustainable era? Sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, we've been thinking a lot about the tech sector, and the tech sector has been, very vocal in, being a front runner in reducing emissions, and which is really important. I mean, it's great to see, Apple committing to fully circular economy by 2030, I think, and Google and Facebook, and now even Amazon, after a lot of prodding and from the workforce and pushing, is now is being more active in this space, which is good to see. But what we're missing at the moment, though, is the fact that these companies influence the behavior of 4 billion people, half the planet of the world, half the planet on Earth. So how can these companies who often have global visions. Their mission statements and vision statements are about some sort of world domination in information or community building or shopping, whatever it might be. How that could be somehow cognizant of the state of the world. How can they use that influence to affect behavior? Because we're seeing the huge negative impacts of their influence in the world. Facebook, for example, and promises a global community, but has created a fractured, polarized world. Google is promising to bring the world's information together, but now we live in an information ecosystem where we don't have a shared worldview based on scientific knowledge. It's fractured and polarized, and so how do these companies use their influence to support societal goals?
So the community that is listening to us today, the Hello Tomorrow community, is all about science entrepreneurship, and following those lines, when they develop a new technology, so when they come up with an idea and want to dominate their market, what do they need to think about today in terms of risks assessment and in terms of their influence on our planet?
Yeah, I think they have a huge responsibility. The world doesn't need more innovation to solve this problem. We're very, very innovative as a species, but this innovation is not targeted. It's undirected at the moment, and it's not clear to me. As Antoine, the previous speaker from Boston Consulting, said, the next decade is going to be transformational. It's going to be a huge revolution, but we're still not sure whether that will drive emissions down. Will that seek to stabilize our planet and enhance biodiversity and help purify water and soils, or whether it will work against those goals and further destabilize the planet? So what we need from the deep tech community and these new emerging companies is we have the chief technology officer, the COO, the CEO. We almost need some sort of chief Anthropocene officer. What will happen if this idea goes global and reaches billions of people? What will be the emergent properties of this idea when it interacts with other big ideas in society, and how can that that emergent property work to restabilize our planet? So a chief Anthropocene officer would be, I think, I'd push for that in new startups.
All right, I think that's a very great idea, and that should be implemented right away in all our deep tech pioneers in our community. So we are almost at the end of our session already, Owen. So I want to take the easy path as moderator, and instead of recapping all you said, because I believe this session will be available for replay, I want to challenge your brain one last time. And so you came up already with this chief Anthropocene officer in a company. What other ideas do you have that we currently are not really discussing? So what would you like to put forward in this world, to put out to this world, what we need to think about that we currently are not?
Cool. I think, I suppose in a nutshell, one thing I'm interested in is fintech. Even green fintech would seem to be, I think there's only one green fintech hub in the world here in Stockholm. I'm really surprised by that. I'd kind of expect far more, but I think we need some, a lot of big change in the world happens through technology. If it's airplanes, if it's cars, if it's high frequency trading, we need some breakthrough technologies, I think, in the finance sector that drive several things. We need some sort of crypto carbon coin that could eventually think about overtaking the US dollar as the currency of last resort on Earth. I'd love to see more thinking, more development around that idea. and even a carbon coin to be created to pull us out of this pandemic recession. What the quantitative easing solutions to pull us out of this recession? Could the IMF and World Bank create a carbon coin that would create, the kind of the resources to invest in green infrastructure and stability? Other things, I think are missing are on the disinformation, and I know you guys are thinking a lot about this. How do we create the kind of media platforms in the world? The mainstream media is now Facebook and Twitter and co. They are the mainstream media. But how do we redesign or create the next generation of these companies where we have trust and based on a shared worldview of the planet? I think that is absolutely critical. And I think a lot of the biggest problems, the biggest challenges in the world today, I'll say this as a final thought, are because of the disillusionment of those who've been left behind over the last few decades of the digital revolution, of the neoliberal economic system from the 1980s. There's been now several generations just left behind who don't feel involved in this growth, this development, this progress. And how do we use tech to actually to engage more people, to pull more people through education, through shared worldviews, through meaningful jobs, this type of thing. I think this is absolutely critical. We will not have a stable planet unless we tackle that level of disillusionment, those left behind. And that's why, just to finish, I'm so pleased to see that you have Richard Wilkinson speaking later today on inequality. I think his book with Kate Pickett, The Spirit Level, is the most important book published in the last few decades, in fact.
Yeah, many inspiring thoughts. I hope everybody took notes. And what's next up for you, Owen, in your journey? I'm pretty sure there will be plenty of surprises we will hear from you, but anything you want to announce?
Let's see. Well, I'm an author on a chapter, an academic book on sustainable finance that's just out. But we have a book coming out next year. Myself and my colleague Johan Rockstrom are publishing a book on the state of the planet and the world in 2050. How we can restabilize the planet, and it is based on some of the thinking we've been speaking about today. And this is also linked to a documentary. We're producing that should be out both out in about April next year. So I'll send you some details when we're closer to launch.
Yes, please do so. Send us the launch dates, and we will distribute that information within our community. Owen, it was a great pleasure to have this chat with you. At the screens at home, please give it up for Owen Gaffney. Thank you very much, Owen. And with this, I give it back to the studio. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. Been a pleasure.